Okay, I think I'll begin. Welcome again, everyone. Today's book launch, Architectures of Emergency, edited by Pınar, Aykaç, Eray, Çaylı, and Sevcan, Ercan, who will be speaking today. My name is Ceren Lord. I am the lead editor of the British Institute Ankara Turkey book series. We're very excited that this is our second showing in this series, which is published together with BIAA-I.B.Tauris, which is an imprint of Bloomsbury Academic. And before I introduce today's speakers, I'd like to briefly tell you about the series itself. We're very proud that the series is distinguished in publishing cutting-edge research monographs and edited collections from a sort of new generation of scholars working on modern Turkey across the social science and humanities. And I would say we're particularly focused on bringing to light innovative approaches that challenge and disrupt established ways of examining Turkey. So if you have a book project that you'd like for us to consider, please contact me or Rory Gormley, who's the commission editor for I.B.Tauris. So yes, so hopefully we'll be doing some more of these talks in the coming months. And I want to remind you that all British Institute of Ankara members are entitled to a 35% discount on all I.B.Tauris publications, including this series. So with that, I'd like to move on to today's talk, Architectures of Emergency, Heritage, Displacement and Catastrophe, which presents a distinct and nuanced intervention into the debate around emergency and urban architectural affairs in Turkey. Our editors of the book, Pınar Aykaç, is an assistant professor in the Department of Architecture, Middle East Technical University. She received her PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL. Eray Çaylı is a Leverhulme Trust Early Career Fellow at the London School of Economics and Political Science. Çaylı has taught, lectured and published widely on the spatial and visual politics of violence, including in his monograph, Victims of Commemoration, The Architecture and Violence of Confronting the Past in Turkey, which has been published in 2021. Sevcan Ercan is a lecturer in the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture, Istanbul at Istanbul Medeniyet University. She received her PhD from the Bartlett School of Architecture at UCL also. Just some technical information before I hand over to our speakers. The talk is being recorded and live streamed on YouTube and will be saved there so you can hear it later on. Audience members, your videos and audios are turned off automatically, so please use the Q&A function to ask questions and I will relay them to the panelists during the Q&A session. And with that, I will hand over to our brilliant speakers and look forward to the Q&A following the talk. Thank you.
So thank you, Ceren. Well, first, I would like to thank the British Institute in Ankara and I.B.Tauris series for organizing this book launch. And as the three co-editors of this book, first, I will kind of speak for 5 minutes to talk about the process behind the book. Then Eray will take about like 20 minutes to summarize the overall framing of the book, its questions and its main arguments. And finally, Sevcan will speak for like 5 minutes to walk us through the individual contributions in the book. So as to how this book project started, it all began in 2016, as many of you may remember, was an important turning point for Turkey in the making of the present authoritarian state, we might say. After the failed coup attempt in July 2016, the Turkish government immediately declared a state of emergency, initially for 3 months, but then in the end it lasted for almost like 2 years. So this period not only normalized repressive policies and practices in many ways, but also affected irreversibly academia and academic freedom in Turkey through state of emergency decrees, which resulted in the expulsion of more than 400 academics. And in fact, it was the end product. The universities in Turkey were already in a state of emergency after the release of the Academics for Peace petition the same year in January, prior to the coup attempt. And after President Erdogan's call to act against the signatories, many universities opened disciplinary investigations, resulting in the indefinite suspension of many academics or opening of criminal investigations. So this was the background when young Eray, Sevcan, and I, as academics working on Turkey, initiated the idea of organizing a symposium concentrated on the challenges of conducting research in the politically volatile context of Turkey. So at the time, Eray was a fresh doctor who was teaching at the Bartlett School of Architecture, whereas Sevcan and I were PhD students at the same school. We shared our idea with the faculty members, Mary Fraser, who is with us today, Jane Randall, and Peg Rose, who all supported our timely proposal. So it's occurred to us to base the symposium on the themes of the challenges of archival research and fieldwork in Turkey. So we were also part of the researchers who were experiencing challenges in our architectural research, and how the experiences of architectural researchers are instrumental in shaping the histories and theories they produce, ranging from the position of the researcher, censorship and self-censorship we discussed a lot among ourselves, or to psychological or ethical implications of archival research and fieldwork. So we applied to the Architecture Research Fund of the Bartlett with Mary Fraser to organize the symposium. After our proposal was accepted, we were very keen to invite scholars working on Turkey who particularly experienced similar challenges due to their research. In addition to Emre Özyetiş and Merve Bedir, whose contributions are already published in the book, we would also like to thank Senem Doyduk and Göksun Akyürek, who presented their work at the symposium, coupled with Zeynep Kezer from the Newcastle University, Davide Deriu from the University of Westminster, and Peg Rose from the Bartlett School of Architecture, who participated as lively and informed discussants. Unfortunately, one of our presenters was denied leaving Turkey, even though they had legally documented rights to board on a plane to London. Actually, this was telling a lot about the substantial hardship they were facing due to their community projects, empowering the marginalized residents of Istanbul and the political milieu of Turkey at the time. So in the end, they managed to attend the conference virtually, and which is now, in fact, the new normal of academia during the pandemic. So in this one-day symposium, the title of the symposium was Field as Archive, Archive as Field, Architectural Insights from Contemporary Turkey. The presenters highlighted the challenges of conducting fieldwork or archival research on topics like migration, human or non-human induced catastrophes, and heritage sites under the prolonged and in the end normalized state of emergency in Turkey. These themes then became the main themes of our book project, which will be explained in detail by Eray. I must also say that the very night of the symposium was some kind of a state of emergency for me, since I received a marriage proposal from my husband. So that's why I am presenting this part of the book launch. So before moving to Eray, we have a long list of people to thank. First, Mary Fraser from the Bartlett School of Architecture, who supported us throughout the entire process from the time when the symposium was just an idea, and also wrote the foreword of the book. Jane Randall, again from the Bartlett School of Architecture, who kindly contributed to the book with her afterword, and our contributors. Some of them are here. I see Banu, for example, from Berkov Foundation, Banu Pekol, Mesut Dinler from Politecnico di Torino, Herdan Doğrul from the Diyarbakır chapter of the Chamber of Architects in Turkey, Emre Özyetiş from the Center for Spatial Justice, and Merve Bedir from Hong Kong University. We also express our sincere gratitude to the two anonymous reviewers, Joseph Robert Graham from Kadir Has University for proofreading the entire book. Most of the authors were not native speakers of English, so we would like to thank him a lot. Yasmin Garcha, the editorial assistant of the book, and I.B.Tauris, contemporary Turkey series editors, including Ceren Lord, who is moderating this book launch today. So I will stop here with the thank yous and hand over to my dear friend Eray Çaylı. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pınar. This has been a long journey, and it's great to see this collective project finally reach fruition. And I second your expressions of gratitude to all those who've contributed in their own way to making this anthology possible. My role tonight, as you said, Pınar, is to present the overall framing of the anthology, and I'll do so by reading an abridged version of the introduction I wrote for the book. I'm actually starting with a parallel that you, I think, alluded to, Pınar, between today, the time of the pandemic, and the time in which we organized that symposium. So I think that's that sort of prophecy is interesting. So emergency, the concept central to our anthology, has gained increasing prominence over the past year and a half, and with spatial import too. In response to the pandemic, governments of various persuasions across the world have implemented spatially charged emergency measures like curfews and lockdowns. Simultaneously, the material politics of such measures have become the subject of much critical debate. Two methodological approaches have stood out in this debate: biopolitics and necropolitics. Inspired especially by Foucault's well-known formulation of biopolitics, the likes of Bruno Latour and Giorgio Agamben have been quick to opine that their respective governments' responses to the pandemic have turned the entire citizenry into quintessential figures of biopolitics. To recall Foucault's classic formulation, whereas prior to the late 18th century, sovereignty meant the power to kill and let live, from that point onwards, a new and different power, biopower, was born, which consisted in making live and letting die. Those challenging emergencies' conceptualization as a question of biopolitics have drawn on necropolitics as theorized by Achille Mbembe. For Mbembe, sovereign power and biopower have not only continued in modern times to operate in tandem, but have also been distributed unevenly across the world. Communities disadvantaged most severely by this uneven distribution have always continued to suffer from a kill and make live policy, even as others have become subjected to make live and let die. Attending to necropolitics has therefore helped highlight that pandemic era emergencies have had vastly differential effects, this difference being due to racialized, gendered, or classed inequalities resulting from violent histories, such as those of colonialism, nation-statism, and imperialism. Now, obviously, the anthology we're launching this evening is not about the pandemic, but I wanted to begin with these recent developments, as I believe they've reiterated the urgency of attending to the material politics of emergency, and doing so with an awareness of its geographically and socially uneven workings resulting from histories of violence. Our anthology engages this topic, emergency, very much with this unevenness in mind as we aim to understand architecture's role in it. But we push the critique of emergency further by asking what role architecture might play in not only producing, but also challenging the uneven impacts of emergency and the violent histories that constitute them. As just such a challenge is already being mounted on the ground, not least among those affected primarily by emergency's uneven workings. The urgency of these questions has arguably been nowhere more salient than in the context of contemporary Turkey, the empirical focus of our book. In late 2015 and 2016, emergency measures were implemented in the name of national security across Turkey's predominantly Kurdish inhabited urban centers. Soon afterwards, a countrywide emergency rule came into force following the failed coup attempt of July 2016, remaining in place for 2 years. During that period, Turkey saw unprecedented levels of construction activity. Interweaving episodes of emergency rule with a construction boom prompts us to ask what a focus on architecture might mean for critical analyses of emergency. Based on research carried out in the mid to late 2010s, we identify 3 phenomena through which to explore this question: heritage, displacement, and catastrophe. We argue that the uneven material politics of emergency is not predetermined by discourse, policy, or legislation alone, but is rather produced, regulated, distributed, and contested through the built environment in both embodied and symbolic ways. It's worth expanding on these 2 defining features of our empirical context, that is mid to late 2010s Turkey. First, a so-called construction boom, and second, the increasing visibility of political tension and acceleration of violence. In its latest iteration, Turkey's construction boom gained pace simultaneously with government-endorsed discourses and practices of democratization that became increasingly prominent between the mid-2000s and the mid-2010s. Specifically, the AKP government launched a series of initiatives promising to confront the legacies of Turkey's histories of state-endorsed violence from the 20th century that had targeted specific communities. A series of culturally oriented reforms were addressed towards historically marginalized communities like Kurds and Alevis, and constitutional minorities such as non-Muslims. The period, moreover, saw the government carry out what were in effect peace talks, although not formally named as such, with the PKK, that is Kurdistan Workers' Party, who since the 1980s have led an insurgency against the state. While limited in scope, the reforms still had popular appeal as they pledged to resolve some of Turkey's longest standing sociopolitical problems. The government instrumentalized the resulting boost in its political legitimacy for the purpose of consolidating its social and economic grip. This instrumentalization manifested in the built environment, whether directly or indirectly. Among the direct manifestations was the revamping of urban areas deemed historical and cultural, where the history and culture in question concerned Turkey's Ottoman past, including those pertinent to the country's once sizable non-Muslim populations. Mid-2005 saw the issuing of a new piece of legislation called the Law for the Protection of Dilapidated Historical and Cultural Real Estate through Protection by Renewal. Now, the adjectives featured in this legislation, dilapidated, historical, and cultural, in effect concealed 2 histories of dispossession, the first of which was triggered by nation-state building in the first half of the 20th century, and the second by Turkey's integration into the post-war global capitalist economy. The primary targets of the first history of dispossession were non-Muslims, who had once constituted a significant part of the urban population until they're being targeted through various measures geared towards their eradication from Turkey, ranging from population exchange, forced labor, and unfair taxation to pogroms, massacres, and genocide. It's important to note here that some Armenians, for instance, have referred to the genocide that targeted their communities as a catastrophe, while members of other communities, such as Yazidis and Assyrian Syriacs, have done so through the term ferman, which means order, sort of indicating what seems to have been the pre-catastrophic normal order of things was for some already a catastrophe. The second relevant history of dispossession targeted rural populations throughout the second half of the 20th century, who, whether due to war in Kurdistan or to capitalist agriculture policies, moved to cities to become the urban poor. This impoverishment occurred especially due to the lack of a social housing policy, filling in many cases the spatial vacuum left behind by non-Muslim populations dispossessed earlier on in the century. Therefore, what the mid-2005 legislation referred to as dilapidation was in fact both the product of non-Muslim dispossession and the abode of dispossessed rural to urban migrants. And histories it referenced included violence, marginalization, impoverishment, and lack of housing provision. Relatedly, the legislation's notion of culture obscured and rendered distant a history otherwise incompatible with dominant formulations of national identity. This notion of culture aimed to prop up the image of a Turkey democratizing and respectful of multiculturalism. In effect, it exacerbated the marginalization of already marginalized communities, like those with a domestic migration background, as it excluded them from what urban culture might entail, or extant non-Muslim communities, as it deprived them of their inheritance by turning this into national heritage. Inhabitants of neighborhoods deemed historical and cultural, albeit dilapidated, were expelled in the name of the protection of such urban areas, two most notorious examples being Istanbul's Sulukule and Tarlabaşı. The state's housing development agency, TOKİ, founded in 1984 to address the long-standing lack of a comprehensive social housing policy, was refashioned in the 2000s to facilitate this expulsion. In such places as Sulukule and Tarlabaşı, as well as in many others that gradually throughout the late 20th century had become home to the urban poor, residents were forced to relocate to TOKİ-built settlements on the peripheries of cities and were thus deprived of the livelihoods they had developed in such neighborhoods. These developments, facilitated by the 2005 legislation, foreshadowed the first contextual feature I wish to unpack, the so-called construction boom in Turkey, and the architectonic role ascribed to historical temporality therein. A series of economic policies that sought to mitigate the negative impact which Asia's rise as the global factory made on Turkish businesses by directing capitalist accumulationist activities of industrially driven corporations to construction and real estate, transformed the construction sector into the foremost driver of Turkey's alleged economic miracle. The government aided this transformation in two ways: through publicly funded large-scale infrastructural projects like bridges and rail transport networks, which catalyzed land speculation and privatization of publicly owned lands, and by launching a comprehensive and legally stipulated episode of physical transformation across urban Turkey through a specific piece of legislation passed in May 2012, known popularly as the Disaster Act. According to the government, the Disaster Act, or the disaster law, was aimed at disaster-proofing the country's building stock, following on from the experience of the violent earthquakes which devastated parts of Turkey's tectonically active northwest in 1999, and which killed nearly 20,000 and destroyed more than 150,000 buildings. But this law's purview has not been limited to vulnerable regions or buildings. Areas redeveloped under this legislation include not just buildings and areas designated as risky, but also zones identified as safe for new settlement. This renders the law's scope so expansive as to make the entire country susceptible to redevelopment. Indeed, over the past 5 years, the authorities have declared numerous neighborhoods in their entirety as urban transformation areas to be redeveloped, often by pro-government contractors. The 2005 legislation had seized control over the present by conjuring up a multicultural past whose remnants were deemed in need of protection. The 2012 disaster law achieved this by invoking the threat of a catastrophic future as an imperative to replace the existing building stock with a new one whose promise was architectonic strength. But land speculation, dispossession, and repossession were central to the processes involved in both these pieces of legislation, or the processes around them. The second feature, central to our book's empirical context, is the increasing visibility of political tension and acceleration of violence. In 2011, civil war broke out in Syria, the country with which Turkey shares its longest border. Turkey's government took a side in the war in late 2011 as Erdogan, then prime minister, called on Bashar al-Assad to quit, and soon moved from rhetoric to practice by working to facilitate his downfall. At first, this occurred indirectly through proxy forces, and then directly through Turkey's own army. By 2012, the two governments were engaging in open combat, and by 2014, the number of Syrian refugees in Turkey had surpassed 1 million. In mid-2013, Turkey's government staged its own violent response to a wave of anti-government protests taking place in the country, which erupted in Istanbul's Gezi Park and Taksim Square, and then rapidly spread across all its cities, barring one. In late 2015 and early 2016, war flared up between the PKK and the state forces in Turkey's southeast, bringing immense destruction to urban centers across the region and causing hundreds of deaths. A coup attempt took place in July 2016, ultimately failing, but causing more than 300 deaths in the process. The government followed by unleashing a witch hunt whose targets included not only the network led by Fethullah Gülen, the US-based cleric, whom the government has blamed for the coup, but also members and supporters of various dissentient movements, such as the pro-Kurdish movement. It was amidst these developments in 2015 and 2016 that Turkey began to witness successive states of emergency, first in urban centers across its southeast, and then following the coup attempt across the entire country. Alongside costing thousands of people their lives, freedoms, and/or jobs, one outcome of these states of emergency that's directly pertinent to urban politics has been the central government's using emergency powers to replace democratically elected pro-Kurdish mayors with unelected ones that it appointed. Countrywide emergency rule was lifted in July 2018, whereas the Southeast specific one continues in a de facto fashion as centrally appointed mayors remain in office to this day. This latest wave of states of emergency has triggered Turkey-specific analyses that attend to the differential effects of emergency. And here I have in mind especially two excellent articles, Saygun Gökariksel and Umut Türem's article, The Banality of Exception, in a special issue of the South Atlantic Quarterly, published in January 2019, and Zerrin Özlem Biner's article, Precarious Solidarities, published in Social Anthropology, December the same year, 2019. These analyses have been astute in identifying the geographically and historically uneven distribution of emergency measures and in attributing this unevenness to longer-standing histories of marginalization that targeted specific communities. But what has remained underexplored is how the states of emergency proper implemented between 2015 and 18 may have shaped and have been shaped by the markedly architectural emergencies the government invoked throughout the late 2000s into the 2010s by appropriating such imperatives as preserving heritage, disaster-proofing the building stock, or sheltering refugees. In using a material and spatial focus to contextualize contemporary politics of emergency in longer-standing histories of marginalization and dispossession, including those where architecture has been given a prominent role, our anthology also makes a methodological contribution to recent spatially focused scholarship in Turkey. Much of this scholarship focuses on neoliberal governmentality and how it affects historic sites, the urban poor, and informal settlements. We hope to nuance this focus by introducing the question of longer-standing histories of nation founding and nation-sustaining violence, and how they might be differentiating the effects of governmentality in the neoliberal era. Empirically, we foreground the material and embodied ways, these effects have been experienced architecturally and have been challenged as such, complementing existing scholarship of relevance that has tended to focus on political rhetoric, ideology, discourse, legislation, and policy. A number of works, if few and far between, have aimed to explore this kind of a focus that we aim to adopt, for instance, through the practical underpinnings and consequences of urban warfare, enabled by the declaration of states of emergency in Turkey's Kurdistan between 2016 and 18, and of socio-political practices of socio-spatial practices of refugees and calls for their incorporation into professional, architectural, and urban responses to displacement. We aim to contribute to these works, especially by developing a unified approach to issues around heritage, displacement, and disasters, which they tend to tackle separately. This kind of an approach, we believe, is necessary because, as I've tried to outline tonight, the histories of violence that inform the uneven effects of emergency have also meant that notions of heritage, displacement, and catastrophe cannot be thought but as inextricably linked with one another. For the displaced and or those whose annihilation was attempted, catastrophe is anything but a novel or imminent threat, and it's this lived experience of marginalization that continues to bear upon what sites are produced and considered as heritage. So that's where I'll stop and hand over to Sevcan, who will walk us through the contributions included in our anthology. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you, Eray and Pınar. It's just left to me to just give an overview of the chapters briefly. Alongside a foreword written by Mary Fraser and an afterword by Jane Randall, our book consists of 8 chapters. An introductory chapter, which Eray has kindly summarized already, 6 core chapters, and a coda. And there are 3 themes in the book, as Eray mentioned again: heritage, displacement, and catastrophe. Although these 3 themes run throughout the book, they also are used to group the 6 core chapters, like 2 chapters per theme. So in the book, following Eray's introductory chapter, the next 2 chapters prioritize the topic of heritage. Chapter 2, which was written by Pınar Aykaç, explores how heritage has been shaped by the emergency footing on which the current AKP government has put the country. First through the Disaster Act in 2012, and then through the states of emergency declared in 2016 and 18. Pınar does so by examining the Hagia Sophia Museum and Atatürk Cultural Center in Istanbul, coupled with the Çaylı district in Ankara. While each of these sites is distinguished by its own features, Aykaç suggests that the authorities' attitudes reveal how the focus of their neo-Ottomanist ambitions have shifted over time. Aykaç argues that this shift reinforced the ongoing state of emergency by intensifying future uncertainty. So in the following chapter, chapter 2, Banu Pekol reflects on her recent experience involved in the conservation of non-Muslim heritage sites across Turkey. For her, such sites were excluded from nation-state building processes and are now deemed at risk as a result. Pekol shows that how the prolonged and near permanent state of emergency has affected these heritage sites in multiple ways since the late 19th century. Taken together, these 2 chapters, chapter 2 and 3, demonstrate the significance of heritage to the politics of emergency in the mid to late 2010s Turkey. Moving on to the theme of catastrophe, chapter 4 and 5 focus on the southeast of Turkey, the area of which remains predominantly Kurdish. In chapter 4, Erdem Doğrul and Eray Çaylı discuss the entanglement between normalcy and emergency as it has unfolded in the city of Diyarbakır, in Kurdish Ahmet, the region's unofficial capital. Together, they reflect on the waves of intense demolition and construction activity which has been taking place in the city's historic center since the late 2000s. This upheaval has been due to the ramifications of the Disaster Act and the sporadic urban warfare between the PKK and Turkey's counterinsurgency forces. In Chapter 5, Emre Özyetic contextualizes the 2015 flare-up between these two protagonists. And he contextualized this recent flare-up within a 35-year-long history of emergency rule in the Kurdish region. This allows Özyetic to conceptualize the impact of emergency rule in the region through the democratic notions such as forum, polis, agora, and paresia, and to rethink those concepts productively. Working in tandem, these two chapters demonstrate the analytical and political potential of rethinking policies connected with the ongoing state of emergency. So the last theme, displacement, is prioritized by the chapters 6 and 7. In chapter 6, Merve Bedir discusses displacement caused by the recent Syrian war and the waves of illegalized migration that have ensued as a result. The discussions draws on Bedir's research-led architectural practice in the city of Gaziantep, which is situated near Turkey's border with Syria. Since the mid-2010s, Gaziantep has become a major hub for displaced people from across Syria. Bedir's chapter conceptualizes the emergency situation within the framework of insufficiency, including the lack of national and international legislation. Bedir argues that the act of solidarity unfolding in various sites she investigates within Gaziantep reshaped the hierarchies between host and guest, both of which featured prominently in mainstream refugee discourse. In chapter 7, which I wrote, I explore the histories of displacement on the island of Gökçeada. The island constitutes the westernmost point of Turkey and one of the only two islands, Aegean islands, in this region, which belong to Turkey. This island constitutes this island, also known as the Imbros in Greek, was historically inhabited by a Greek population, and these Greek populations were also known as the Rum. My focus in my chapter is on a major community festival held on the island by the Rum diaspora. I follow a process which began in the mid-2010s, whereby the festival first enjoyed an unprecedented popularity and surging attendance figures before becoming the subject of emergency controls imposed by the state authorities, local and central. Taken together, these last two core chapters, offer us the chance to rethink the theme of displacement within the context of everyday, in which the practices of refugees and returning minorities are examined for the insights they hold. These 6 core chapters I mentioned are followed by a coda authored by Mesut Dinler. This coda interweaves all these 3 themes of displacement, catastrophe, and heritage. And Dinler discusses the cases of Fener and Balat. Fener and Balat are the two Istanbul's oldest neighborhoods situated along the Golden Horn. Once the epicenter of Istanbul's Jewish and Greek Orthodox communities, these neighborhoods underwent a significant demographic overhaul between the late 19th and mid-20th centuries, during which Turkey emerged as an ethnically based nation state. From the 1980s onwards, these 2 neighborhoods have been gradually transformed into a prime target for Istanbul's real estate speculators. Dinler, in his chapter, asks To what extent the historical processes of displacement that took place in Fener and Balat might help us to understand the threat of new ones. In so doing, he argues that the way in which international and national approaches to historic urban environments relate to one another involves a greater degree of continuity than is often acknowledged. This was the brief summary of the chapters. I hope you will buy the book, at least some of you. Thank you.
Thank you to all the speakers. I'm really looking forward to the Q&A now. Everyone, please feel free to enter your questions in the Q&A box, and I will relay them to the speakers. But in the meantime, I have some questions myself, which I would like to ask the presenters. I should also mention that some of the contributors are here also, and hopefully they will be able to answer any specific questions relating to their contributions in the book. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, maybe perhaps, I guess it's something that came to my mind reading Pınar's chapter, was about the kind of what is the theme that runs across the book is the continuities and the breaks within the heritage politics in Turkey. So Pınar juxtaposes the sort of the neo-Ottomanist versus the early Republican sort of contestation within the state level, I suppose. And then, you know, in the next chapter we have Peko's chapter talks about the sort of, you know, long-standing continuities, so this is from the Ottoman era in terms of the approach to non-Muslim minorities in Turkey. So I guess just what strikes me is sort of the multi-layered sort of nature of heritage politics, and I wondered if, you know, you could just expand on these a little bit more. One other thing that I was, when I read Eray's chapter on Diyarbakır and your sort of usage of Jongadan's, you know, work on sort of internal colonization and so on, and in sort of the Kurdish areas, was that I was struck actually. I mean, I visited Diyarbakır in 2011, I guess after the construction boom had started, and then in 2015 I went to Tibet, and in the capital was really struck by how much there was the parallels in terms of what I felt, what I saw entering Diyarbakır, and the sort of the Turkification that had begun already, and then also what China was doing in Tibet, and, you know, sort of emptying out the sort of the center and then building an entire kind of new city in the outskirts, and then packing it with non-Tibetans, Chinese from the mainland China. And it's just, it really struck me the sort of the relationship between the construction demographics and also the issue of sort of memory. So I just wondered if you could, I guess, say a bit more about your, in terms of the field that you did, the sort of the nature of sort of demographic engineering, you know, aside from sort of the physical changes of, you know, that have resulted in Turkey, but there is a serious demographic engineering that's also taking place, that is sort of a double impact on, I guess, people's memory and our memory of places and communities. And then I will mute myself, and I'll await for some Q&As after.
So thank you, Ceren. I think I might start maybe with, since me and Banu more or less wrote on the heritage theme of the book. So when we talk about like our kind of actually chapters like speak to each other in a way. So what I emphasize is more like after the Ottoman Empire, when the Turkish Republic was founded, what was the official discourse in terms of appropriating the Ottoman past. And so the official discourse more or less reduced the diverse Ottoman past to a national monument idea, and that a secularist or nationalist ideology affected this diverse past of the Ottoman Empire, especially the what we call now the minority heritage or the heritage of non-Muslims, as well as other ethnicities other than Turkey. So this was something that was widely challenged, discussed, and criticized, especially after the 1980s and 1990s. But when AKP came to power, actually it was in 2002, and more or less in the beginning of the 2000s, in relation to the ambition to enter EU. So the government started to challenge this official heritage discourses by concentrating on the Ottoman Empire and reframing the Ottoman past as a multicultural past. But then in long run, from the 2010 onwards, in a way, the neo-Ottomanism more or less is reframed as the Islamic and Turkish past of Turkey. So in a way, like the cases I discussed are more or less the symbols of the early republic, I can say, the official ideology of the republic, Atatürk Cultural Center, or Saraçoğlu Quarter, or Ayasofya, whereas in Banu's case, more or less she discusses on the heritage of different groups, religious groups and ethnic groups in Turkey. So Neo-Ottomanism in a way first focused on these different heritage places which were overlooked in the early Republican period, but then they came back as a team, but then they were used to reframe Neo-Ottomanism through these heritage sites, I can say. I hope I answered your question. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. I mean, would you say there's kind of a perhaps a kind of hierarchy in a way also of the approach to different sites and communities? I mean, I just think if you could sort of compare the approach towards sort of Christian or Jewish sites versus, say, Alevi and Bektashi sites, one left to ruin, one seized and appropriated and Islamized. I mean, Eray has also done some work on the latter as well, so maybe you can answer to that. But I mean, do you see a sort of different types of policies towards different communities, perhaps?
I think like it's yes or no. Yes, in relation to the time frame, I can say, especially if we consider the recent past of Turkey, especially the Rum community, I can say, or Armenian community, as well as the Jewish community. The heritage sites associated to these communities were at the forefront when AKP was kind of presenting itself as a conservative Democrat party, I can say. But towards the recent past, I might say the hierarchy changed in relation to the recent politics. So maybe Eray might continue from here. He might talk more about the recent politics of different groups in a way.
Thank you very much.
I've already spoken quite a bit, and Ceren asked a question directly to me, so I just maybe want to address that question and then let you folks speak as well, because I think Sevcan's work also addresses the question that you just raised. Pınar. But obviously, these issues are related, and this is one of the points of the book, right? To bring together these discussions around heritage, troubling pasts, and the recent kind of interest in kind of this resilience, disaster resilience practices, and the displacement that lies behind those and is actually caused by those as well. But in terms of your question, Ceren, yeah, I mean, that's an interesting parallel. Something that hasn't occurred to me, obviously. Tibet isn't a place that I know well. But in a nutshell, I could maybe say this. And this is coming from both my co-author, whom I have to, well, I wish he was here. I have to, thank him again. This is really the first time when, as a kind of side note, it's the first time where I'm writing something, a kind of scholarly text with what I guess anthropologists call an interlocutor. So that's yet another reason why this volume is special for me. Herdem Doğru. What I've learned from him and others who've worked on these issues in Ahmet Diyarbakır with him is that, again, whereas the kind of developments that you often associate with Turkey, or the purposes, like what's known as rant in Turkish, or rent, this kind of idea of profit-led speculative development, etc. There's obviously that aspect to it when they happen in a place like Turkey's Kurdistan, but they're never just about that. There's something always like more than just this idea of money and speculation, etc. And that is why the framework of approaching this question through the kind of more traditional way of, it's the state kind of creating its crony capitalist networks, and it's about money, and it's about speculation and land speculation, doesn't quite suffice. And this is where we've tried to use this kind of framework of intercolonization, and why it's different from, say, other framings of colonization is because it's a lot, territorially speaking and temporally speaking, it's a lot more non-linear than this Foucauldian understanding of stuff happening first in the colony and then moving towards the metropole. It's a lot more non-linear than that. Obviously, when the kind of Toki-led developments arrive in a place like Ahmed, they do arrive with that promise of financial gain, and that's the kind of imaginary attached to them. But if you look at the way they operate on the ground, sometimes stuff's built where it doesn't make sense financially even to build it. I mean, it's just like it just doesn't make sense, as an investment, and yet it's built there. And why? Well, that's where a different motivation that is historically specific, historically grounded, that targets specific communities. In this case, you could say, Kurds, but also builds on former histories in that very region that have targeted other kind of communities like Armenians, non-Muslims, come into play, right? So, and that's why you have to kind of approach the question with that kind of difference. And that's how, again, elsewhere I've written on this kind of idea of a more kind of non-linear colonization, which Joe Turner, I'm using his framing terms, intercolonization, means that there's this kind of financial promise attached to this kind of intervention that then arrives into a place like Kurdistan with that promise, but then turns into something that doesn't make sense financially, and it's trying to do something else, and then comes back to other places elsewhere in Turkey, having sort of tried and, well, partially you could say succeeded in in transforming society, transforming space in ways that are more than just financially motivated. And this is why, for instance, we've seen, I mean, a great example is, well, a troubling example, I should say, is what happened after the war. During the war, in 2015-16, you had an amendment made to the Disaster Act. The Disaster Act, remember, was initially kind of issued promising to disaster-proof the building stock. An amendment was made during that war to include threats to public safety as being one of a possible form of disaster. So that amendment was made directly to that act that was initially about disaster resilience, and then that was used in Kurdistan to transform urban centers. But then that was taken to practical implications were then witnessed in the west of Turkey, particularly in neighborhoods that have known to be dissentient and that have nothing to do with disaster, because they sit on absolutely the most solid kind of grounds ever. There's no way they're going to be demolished or destroyed in an earthquake. But this again amendment that was first kind of introduced by using the war in Kurdistan as a kind of pretext was then implemented elsewhere in Turkey. So I don't know if that answers. I mean, I'm obviously thinking out loud and also trying to think generatively, because I think this anthology, well, we hope will generate more discussions and more work and further research. But yeah, I think in a nutshell, that's what I could say.
Thank you very much, Eray. It was a big question, perhaps. I have a question here from Murray Fraser. He asks, has the ability of architects through their projects to resist the kinds of displacement and appropriation you mentioned improved or worsened in recent years? I remember that being a major issue of discussion at the initial symposium. I guess that's to all of you.
Pınar told me to answer this question, but I don't know. I have an answer. I feel like everything got worsened in a way, but it might be my own subjective understanding of the situation. Because all these like construction amnesties and these other laws are kind of blocking people to do their job properly. But then there are some other improvements, I think, in the public sphere, like these, the mayors of Istanbul and Ankara have been changing things quite drastically in a good way, especially in terms of conservation. The mayor of Istanbul, the municipality, is running its own kind of construction team, and they have been kind of doing all these big scale conservation projects. I think in terms of conservation, things are going better maybe, but I don't know. I kind of leave it like that.
Maybe also like we were talking about pandemic, and also Eray emphasized. So I think like after long years of state of emergency and pandemic, and the its kind of restrictions are used in such a way that it's more or less almost impossible to protest publicly. Like the public space is a bit closed due to pandemic regulations. Like, of course, it's not closed, but certain protests can be made, but certain protests cannot. So maybe in relation to the pandemic, we as architects or activists or academics cannot really do a lot in relation to these developments.
So Herdem is here. And I think we can include him in this conversation. I mean, I obviously answered at length to the question pertaining to our chapter, but at least he could, I think, speak to this question as well that Murray just asked. And maybe I can translate for him. Herdemciğim merhaba. Şimdi bizim bölümle ilgili bir soru geldi. Ona ben cevap verdim. O yüzden oraya dönmesek bile bir soru daha var yeni. O da bence seninle alakalı olabilir. Aslında görüşlerini belirtebilirsin. O da son dönemde böyle radikal mimarlık pratikleri adına ortam daha mı iyi, daha mı kötü, neler var? Böyle son dönemdeki hani biz bu kitabı yazdığımız vakit işlediğimiz konular belki biraz daha şimdi artık 4-5 sene öncesinin konusu gibi kaldı. Ama daha yeni dönemde bir güncelleme yaparsan biraz daha radikal kent mimarlık pratikleri adına ne dersin?
Herkese çok selam. Çok özür diliyorum, geciktim. Eve yeni gelebildim. Ya şimdi aslında durum çok öyle iyi değil. Yani 4-5 sene öncesinde seninle konuştuğumuzda, burada çalıştığımızda durum belki biraz daha iyiydi şimdiye göre. Yani o zaman bir şey pratiğimiz vardı. Yani en azından bir itiraz pratiğimiz vardı. Olan bitene karşı belgeleme, raporlama, itiraz etme, isyan etme pratiğimiz vardı. Ama bu 5 yıllık, 6 yıllık süreç biraz şey yaptı. Çok böyle durağanlaştırdı her şeyi. Yani aslında gündem dışı kaldı gibi kent meselesi. O yüzden hani Türkiye'yi ve Kürdistan'ı takip ettiğinizde kente dair çok bir söz söylenmiyor uzunca bir süredir. Şey de olmuyor. Yani o kadar korkunç bir yıkım süreciyle karşı karşıya kaldık ki işte o 5 yıl önceki süreçte. O korkunç tablonun akabinde bugün yapılanlar belki biraz şey de gelmiyor. Yeterince vahim de gelmiyor, algılanmıyor. O yüzden hani biraz kent hareketleri pasifize olduğu gibi geliyor bana. Belki de ben uzak kaldım bilmiyorum ama gözlemlediğim bu en azından. Oradan siz nasıl görüyorsunuz bilmiyorum. Hani biraz şey gibi oldu. Bu ölümü gösterip sıtmaya razı etme meselesi var ya, siyasetin her alanında olduğu gibi. Kent meselesinde de biraz ona evrildik gibi geliyor. Çünkü şeyi yaşadık yani çok acı bir tecrübeyle kent nasıl yok edilir? Bunu işte 6-7 Kürdistan kentinde yaşadık. O yok edilme sürecinden sonra şu an biraz şey noktasında duruyoruz gibi açıkçası. Özellikle kent hareketleri bağlamında söylüyorum. Ya bir noktada uzlaşılabilir mi? Bir noktada bu iktidarların kente dair politikaları zayıflatılabilir mi? Biraz daha işte normalize edilebilir mi noktasında bir arayış var. Yani 5 yıl önceki o itiraz, yüksek sesle itiraz halimiz, işte yapamazsınız, edemezsiniz, suçtur halimiz biraz şeye evrildi gibi geliyor bana. Ya tamam gördük yani yapmaya karar verdiğinizde öldürerek olsa yapıyorsunuz. Bütün aygıtları kullanarak yapıyorsunuz. Ama en azından bir alanı biraz daha sınırlama, belki hani işte yıkımların ya da dönüşümlerin boyutunu, çapını biraz daha minimize etme üzerine bir çabaya evrildi. Tabii bu tamamıyla şey bir durum, yani konjonktürel bir durum. Yani ülkenin genel siyasi atmosferiyle de doğrudan ilişkili. Yani şu noktada benim en azından bir giriş anlamında kısaca söyleyebileceğim bu.
Teşekkürler. I'll just quickly translate at least the gist of it. Herdem said the following. The situation is not very bright. During and immediately after the war, the Chamber of Architects in his hometown had a practice of dissent and opposition through kind of documentation practices, and the production of reports on destruction and such kind of responses to what was happening. But more recently, urban affairs have sort of become sidelined by politics in a wider sense, maybe party politics, you could say, or mainstream kind of understanding of politics. Whereas previously, that which is urban and architectural was much more central to it. The devastation was so vast that although initially we tried to stop it again, or document it later on, and write up observations and reports on it, ultimately, more recently, the effort has inevitably been geared towards limiting it, and limiting at least the size of the areas that are devastated and radically, profoundly transformed. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell.
Thank you very much, Eray and Erdem. We have another question from Daniel. He asks, when looking at examples of housing and living solutions for marginalized communities, how confident can you be in understanding their preferences? What are the methodologies that can be used to arrive at such an understanding? I guess that's to all of you.
Can you repeat the question, Gerald?
It's when looking at housing and living solutions for marginalized communities, how confident can you be in understanding their preferences? What are the methodologies that can be used to arrive at such an understanding?
Thank you.
So I'm more like a heritage person, of course, but maybe from the perspective of historic neighborhoods that were kind of renewed after the Renewal Act. So in a way, we in the book also, we stress that although there are a lot of research on the rules and regulations of the period and how they affected a specific group or a specific region is widely discussed. We really try to concentrate on context-specific cases to reduce generalizations. So in terms of methodologies, of course, there can be like varying methodologies, but a methodology that bases people's like people-centered approaches should be included in a way, as we researchers should be working, not should maybe, but it might be better that we can work together with the community, as one of our contributors did. So those are the things that came to my mind.
I can follow up. I mean, my PhD was, the island was my PhD subject, the island that I mentioned on my talk. And it was, I worked with a kind of minority group who was displaced from Turkey. So it was quite challenging for me because I was educated as an architect and I didn't know how to approach these. I didn't have the tools of kind of anthropological, sociological research methodologies. But I think what I developed in time is to kind of spending enough time to let the community leaders to show me what they want to show or what they think is important. So I kind of developed my methodology not like prior to my research, but instead I developed it along the time. So it kind of involved like interviews turned into more like site visits, like a huge groups of site visits instead of like one-to-one interviews, which are very problematic by minority groups because they don't feel secure about signing anything or having this private interview with a maybe Turkish scholar. And my research was sponsored by the Turkish state, which was also another kind of dilemma for me. So I had this almost like context-specific methodologies I had to develop in order to kind of make my, let's say, informants feel safe about my intervention. I try to keep it more like space-specific rather than focusing solely on the memories of these people. We kind of exchange information on sites and exchange information about the sites in general. I think it's difficult. I kind of have this difficulty during my research. I don't think there's a kind of one solution to solve this being outsider kind of problem.
Eray, were you going to add anything or no? Okay. Okay, thank you, everyone. Maybe I'll just, I guess, a little bit related, I'd ask, well, if anyone else has any questions, please continue to write them in the Q&A box, please. Otherwise, I'll ask some further questions before we wrap up. So on sort of the questions that we've been sort of talking about, of course, your much of your focus is on the sort of more marginalized communities and their experiences with this state of emergency. And I guess my question is also, so for example, the AKP base is also, subject to some of the, are experiencing these sort of displacements and alienations as well, in terms of, the sort of displacement that results from Toki and the sort of urban renewal and so on. And I just wondered if there was any interaction or, solidarity or any, kind of, commonalities that you might have experienced in the field, or any sort of crossovers, empathies between different sections of these communities at all. Yep, I'll ask that, and I'll wait for further questions. For any of the panelists, of course.
I mean, I don't know if this directly responds to your question, but you could say a negative solidarity in the sense that, the kind of appeal of nationalism, and obviously, various political crises have continued to take place since the historical junctures that I referenced in my talk, particularly further interventions in Syria, this kind of scare around refugees, right? So I think these kind of developments are used to create, I guess, what I would call from my own perspective, a kind of regressive solidarity between, say, some communities that have themselves been marginalized, been subjected to marginalization, and others that have not been so. And yeah, so otherwise, in a more positive sense, or what I would consider positive as in more progressive sense. I mean, at least in terms of first-hand experience, I can't really think of anything at the moment, but maybe others will jump in.
Yeah, I guess it's interesting that you know, some of these forces, obviously some of these forces are targeted, but then there are also other forces, the urban renewal and so on. Projects have implications for everybody, much more generalized, and yet the political repercussions and people's experiences of it and their responses to it are very different. It could be an AKP voter who feels very marginalized by the fact that this urban renewal has led to displacement and complete alienation from their communities. But their response to it will be very different to someone maybe in a leftist Alevi Kurdish neighborhood. But anyway, so we have one further question. And Daniel asks, have the new municipal authorities in Ankara and Istanbul signaled a departure on how they deal with urban heritage, and if so, in what direction? Back to mid-2000s multicultural signifiers?
I don't know, anything we say can be a wishful thinking, I think, at this point. So I haven't received, like professionally, I mean, any signal of change yet, but who knows?
I think in terms of conservation in Istanbul, the municipality is quite active, if that's the question. I kind of difficulty to follow. I have a bit of a cold and my ears are popping up. So it was, as I understood correctly, yeah, I kind of see a lot of conservation activity run by the Istanbul's mayor, and he has a kind of very big team, which is very, all the processes are kind of very open to kind of discussion, and there are new teams of neighborhood representatives in historic neighborhoods, and they are kind of, I don't know, I'm positive about the current conservation activities in Istanbul, as you can see. One good thing I can see is that.
Maybe I can say, like, now it's in terms of heritage sites, the major thing going on is who is responsible for what, and especially heritage places that are administered or kind of managed by the local authority, like the Istanbul Metropolitan Municipality, were one by one taken by the central government or the Directorate of Foundations. So from Ankara's side, maybe from my side, things might get worse in a way for heritage sites, but we'll see.
I've been thinking about the previous question because, obviously, I think this question is maybe more pertinent to Sevcan and Pınar. So I think they've given excellent answers. But on the previous question, obviously, I forgot to mention one important initiative that I can think of, where a kind of solidarity that's irreducible to divisions in party politics has emerged, although not recently. So I think this is why I forgot, because I focused too much on the recent years. But the initiative I had in mind was Mahalleler Birliği, which translates as Union of Neighborhoods, operating mainly in the west of Turkey. and they've kind of grouped gradually in the late 2000s, early 2010s, particularly in places that have been subjected to urban transformation under this, and most recently under this new law, the disaster law. Well, not so new now, the law that was passed in 2012. And that is not really, you could argue, party political. In fact, I mean, one of their promises is that, you know, they're kind of almost against being party political. And that is interesting. Yeah, at least that's something I can offer in the way of a positive note, but others will be more informed, I think.
I think we've also brought in Mr. Dinler. Hope you're on. Yeah, and I also, you know, I really liked your chapter also, and I was going to ask about you talk about the post-2005 changes marking a, you know, turning point in terms of urban conservation, and yeah, it would be, I mean, we don't have very much time, unfortunately, but it'd be good to get your some your thoughts also on what's been discussed.
Yeah, hello everyone. Maybe I can say a few words to support what Eray has just said about the initiatives and solidarity movements, even though, of course, the instruments of power are not so generously given to them, especially after the 2005 changes in many historic neighborhoods of Istanbul and also in Ankara, actually. There has been some resistance, and citizens were, and the inhabitants were able to organize themselves to seek for legal assistance to resist against regeneration projects. And maybe we can say, I'm not sure if the victim is the correct word, but the inhabitants of the later projects were even more fortunate because they were able to learn from the experience of the former victims, and they were able to stay more cautious about the possible discriminations of their rights on the city. So in general, these emergency situations always allow power to concentrate even more power and practice it, but it is not always, even though it is not so visible, there are always some resistance within it as well. We can see it in the when we look at the bottom-up initiatives, maybe we are able to see those resistance, and we can also, I mean, I'm also a heritage person, whatever that means, but we can hopefully, maybe as researchers, we have the responsibility to historically put some light on such movements of resistance. Maybe this is my contribution to this closing of the seminar.
Thank you very much, Mr. We have another question, and we have literally 3 minutes left. So I guess if I'll ask it, but if it can be kind of quick in wrapping it up. Alison Snyder asks she says this was excellent, and she would like to ask about on the streets fieldwork surveying, asking specifically about transformation perceptions to local. Is this any part of the work being done in Istanbul, for example?
Yeah, loads. Maybe too numerous to mention here. I'll just mention one name because she's in the audience. Kamile Batur, for instance, works on this. Yeah, quite a bit. I think of particularly in Istanbul. I think there's quite a lot of research on that. And in terms of, yeah, I think there's a comment by someone called Rebecca Clendenin, who says these resistance initiatives are my dissertation topic precisely. And those two things are often interrelated. So Alison might want to get in touch with Rebecca as well.
Thank you very much. I guess we can wrap up. If anyone has any last words, thank you so much for your excellent talk and also your answers. I really enjoyed it, and congratulations on the book and also publishing as part of our series. We are very proud of the whole series. So yeah, any final things about your book? And everyone, please remember, you can get a discount if you become a BIAA member of 35%. So well worth it.
Thank you so much. Thank you all. Thank you to Herdem again, just as a personal thanks, because I don't think he got to hear my thanks to him earlier. And it really, I mean, I personally hope that yeah, this generates more research, as I said, that inspires more of this research into this intersection of the kind of issues that we've explored in this book. And thanks obviously a lot to the co-editors, my fellow co-editors, because this has been really the first truly collective publication project that I've been involved in.
Will it be the last? I'm not sure, but hopefully not. I also would like to thank my co-editors, I can say my friends, and Ceren and BIA, and all the contributors. Thank you.
Thank you very much, guys. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you for the audience as well, and your patience. And hopefully see you next book launch, which will probably on the Arab Alawites of Turkey by Hakan Mertcan, possibly next year sometime. Yeah, we will be releasing the news when we have more information on the publication date. Thank you very much, everyone, and good evening.